Hello, I'm Heather Stone, Executive Editor of the Habitat Group and the publisher of New York Apartment Law Insider. Today, we're talking with William J. Neville of the law firm of Mitofsky, Shapiro, Neville, and Hazen on landlord-tenant issues during the COVID outbreak. Thank you, Bill, for being with us.
Thank you, Heather. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
And I see that on our recording, your name presents under your picture as Eileen Neville. That's your wife because you're at your wife's computer, but this is indeed Bill Neville speaking.
Yes.
And we're taking some questions from subscribers, and a subscriber wrote to us with the question, if a tenant in a residential building gets sick, do we have to maintain his privacy? And should we make other tenants aware that the tenant is sick?
First of all, I'm not an expert on HIPAA and privacy law, but my understanding is that you need to maintain that tenant's privacy. That said, you may want to take certain steps to keep the common areas especially clean and follow the various governmental guidelines that have been published by the various government agencies.
Okay.
Now, the other point on that I'd like to make is that if there is a tenant who is sick and they make a request for a reasonable accommodation, I think you should take whatever steps you can to grant that accommodation if you believe it's reasonable.
Yes, that's an excellent point. We have another question. With a moratorium on evictions in effect, what advice would you give landlords who have pending eviction cases and landlords who foresee having to file non-payment cases as soon as they're able to?
Well, what I would suggest, first of all, is people bear in mind that this is a very fluid situation and things are changing on a daily basis, if not hourly basis. As things currently stand, the process servers can serve papers. They are unable at this point to purchase index numbers, so that prevents notice of petition and petitions from being commenced. That said, the time it takes to get to that point of serving a notice of petition and petition, I believe leads to the conclusion that owners should be preparing the rent demands and the late rent letters and sending them to their tenants. Let's look at the timeline involved in a non-payment. Generally my advice is in the second month, at this point with the 5-day notice, I say on the 5th day of the second month, you should be commencing a rent demand. And at the same time, you send out the late rent letter, which can go at the same time as you're processing the rent demand. The rent demand itself is 14 days. So by the time you communicate with your attorney with the information to commence the rent demand, that's a couple of days. Generally, we can turn around the rent demand in a day, and then that goes back to the owner. They have to sign it, and then it has to come back to my office, and then we send it to the process server. The rent demand is no longer a 3-day rent demand, it's a 14-day rent demand. And you also have to give time for the process server to serve it. So that rent demand, you have to think it's going to take at least 3 weeks. And for the processing of it and getting it signed, add another week. So you're looking at about a month before the non-payment demand is ready to turn into what we call the notice petition and petition. So hopefully within a month's time, we'll be in a position to be able to purchase index numbers and to get those cases started. And I would believe that you would be ahead of the game as to anybody who is waiting, because you have to remember also the court is going to be overwhelmed when they first open up again because of all the cases that were scheduled for all these days and that have been adjourned to late April and early May. Yeah. So you can get into court, the better chance you have. And another point you might want to consider is that when you serve these rent demands, you may start a dialogue with your tenant to maybe do some kind of a short-term out-of-court agreement where they agree to make certain payments.
Yeah, I would think there there's going to be a lot of confusion and a lot of people worried about paying the rent. And yeah, I think some short-term arrangements might be made. I don't know. Have you heard anything about the state trying to hold off on or easing rent payments for people in, say, rent stabilized apartments? Or
I have not heard anything definitive with regard to that. I just know there's a 90-day moratorium on the actual eviction. So once that gets lifted, the marshals are going to be backed up also. So because the
right.
marshals are limited as to how many they can do in a particular day. So it's all going to be delayed. And so
Right.
until you get in a position to make some kind of a deal with the tenant, and I'm hoping that in these kinds of situations, the one-shot deal will be helpful. The government will kind of get involved. Hopefully, these will be any type of person who's getting a short-term layoff. They'll have their job back, and they'll be able to get a one-shot deal where they either get a grant from the government or they get a loan from the government. It's better to have the loan coming from the government than from the landlord giving an interest-free loan.
Right. Okay, very good. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, for watching us. And if you have any questions that you'd like us to ask our board members, like Mr. Neville, please send us questions to me at hstone@thehabitatgroup.com. And thank you for watching, and thank you, Bill, for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me. Everybody, stay safe out there.